How many people are on?
I was going to, unfortunately, I think Mike realized today that 6:30 in the evening Central was 2:30 in the morning in South Africa,
Yeah.
so he opted not to join us after all. I don't blame him for that, but just to warn you, in the invitation to this tasting, I identified you as the legendary winemaker Zelma Long. So not only and of course I didn't know your husband was going to join us, or I would have said something equally laudatory about him. But not only do you have to carry the baton for you and Mike, but you have to be legendary.
Well, after 50 years in the business, I can do that.
I was going to remind, I'm sure you don't remember this, but I actually have a personal connection with both you and Mike. I used to own a wine store in Nashville, and I sold so much Three Cape Ladies that somebody gave me a trip to South Africa to visit Mike, and for a week. First class airfare from Nashville to Johannesburg in a week at visiting him and learning about the winery. And I wasn't able to go, so my nephew Sean went. I think he may have spent most of the time surfing and not really learning much about wine because that's kind of who he was. But I don't, you may not, I'm sure you don't remember this, but about 15 years ago, probably, you and I hosted, Zelma, you and I hosted a tasting in Nashville at the incredible antebellum home of Tom Black.
Yes,
do you remember that?
Yeah, that was early when we were just introducing the Vilafonte wines.
Right. Right. And I think after can't remember if it was a tasting or a dinner, but afterwards, as was often the case with Tom, we all went in the kitchen and we all went down in his unbelievable wine cellar and were just told to just pick things that we wanted to taste. And he often encouraged people to pick something from their birth year because he had more than enough wine going far enough back that even I would be able to pick something from my birth year. And I do know that we opened a 62 Leroy La Romanée that night because that's one of the greatest wines I ever tasted, and it was with you in his kitchen.
Yeah,
so
I remember the event. I have to admit, I don't remember the wine, which is what I should remember.
Yeah.
What I remember though is.
So that was your birth year, 62.
Well, I'm a little older than that. Probably he opened an 82 first growth for Zelma's birth year.
Good recovery.
Yes.
Phil, were you there? Were you at that tasting also, or was it just Zelma? I think it was.
Yes, I was there as well.
You were there. Huh. Well, the truth is that you are both legendary. And I hope everybody's poured themselves a glass of the seriously old dirt and are enjoying that. But I was hoping that the two of you would tell us a little bit. I mean, I know some people on this screen are intellectual enough that they've researched you and they know about your amazing careers. But I'd really love it if you'd talk about who you are, because you are actually, in truth, pretty extraordinary, both of you.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask us to talk about why we went to South Africa.
Well, I'm going to ask that
the normal
next.
question.
I'm going to ask that next, but I think that people should know that you were the head winemaker at Robert Mondavi, and you were the head winemaker at Moet Hennessy, and you were the head winemaker at Simi back when they made really amazing. So would you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I became interested in wine. I grew up in Oregon, no wine background. moved to San Francisco, and my parents-in-law planted vineyards in Napa Valley. And I became interested in maybe someday making wine from those vineyards. And I went back to school at UC Davis to study enology and viticulture with 4 other people in my class.
Wow.
A small
And that
group.
was Long Vineyards, right?
That was Long Vineyards,
Long Vineyards,
exactly.
with your husband, Bob, right?
Exactly. And I started at Mondavi in 70. We started Long Vineyards in 76. And then 80, I moved to Simi, where I was for the next 20 years as winemaker and CEO. And during that time, Phil and I decided it would be fun to make wine somewhere else in the world. So let me turn it over to him to tell you a little bit about his background.
Yeah, so I'm a flight risk. No, not a flight risk. I fled from basic sciences. My education is actually as a research biochemist, and I was at UC Berkeley doing a postdoc, and I formally fell in love with the concept of wine, and had a friend who was working in the wine business in Napa Valley, and he encouraged me to come up and understand what was going on with the wine industry. And so I decided that it would be a good, although I hadn't matured in my first career, it would be a good time to start a second one. And and so I got involved in the wine business. And the thing I thought I could bring to the business is to really have an understanding of the concept of wine growing. That is, growing wine to a specific and growing grapes to make those wines to specific objectives of the type, style, characters that one was looking for. So I used my academic background and the ignorance is bliss kind of thing to plow into trying to understand how wine growing would work. And that took me through a vineyard management stint working with this friend of mine, doing that for a period of time. And then, and that gave me an opportunity to really see how you do this operations to change the characters of the outcoming wines. And then I went to work for Robert Mondavi Winery, and I was there during the period of time when we were developing this idea about wine growing and practicing it. I was the person who purchased all the grapes, worked with all the growers, ran an experimental program, and then had a responsibility for outreach to take things that we learned at the winery back out to our growers. So it was a perfect opportunity, kind of a working laboratory for practicing on or developing practices to try to achieve what we wanted to see. And we were following all those wines through to their through the fermentations and to their finish. So that kicked me off, and then I left Mondavi, and I was there during a period of time when Opus was up and running, getting up and running. The winery was Opus Winery was being built. We had acquired vineyards in Mondavi, had acquired vineyards in the Central Coast, and the project in Lodi with the Robert Mondavi Woodbridge wines was expanding so rapidly. So I had a pretty large environment in which to work and to learn, to accelerate the learning. And so that was the history. And then we were invited in 1990. Zelma and I were invited to come to South Africa to do some technical presentations to the Cape Estate wine producers. And the Cape Estate wine producers was a group of producers who were unlike the California industry or the American US industry. In South Africa, there were a lot of controls on trying to keep the production from going overly large and destroying the market. And so there, people had to have certain permissions to plant vineyards, and there were some controls on the yields and so forth. And in that, there was also a sense of very few of the actual producers who were making wine actually finished their wines into bottled labeled wines that they did on their own. So they maybe have their vineyards, they may have made the wines on site, but a little bit like in some areas in France where people then sell those wines on to someone who elevates them, would barrel age them, put them in bottle, maybe not use the producer's, the grower's name on the label, or might use another name on the label. And these Cape Estate wine producers were individuals who had bolted out of that system, and they were pretty much as we think about grape growers, winemakers, and selling. Anyway, they were very concerned at the time about post-apartheid and becoming engaged in the rest of the world in the sense of making wines, and they were discovering things like the use of barrels, which is they had specifically asked Zelma to work with them and to present with them, and I was working on some issues of the aspects of wine growing. We were there for a fairly short period of time, but it made a big impact on us, and I think made a dent on the South African industry as well. Things have changed a little bit since that time, but that's what gave us the bug, and then we started our own project with purchasing a piece of land, and that's now known as the Vilafonte Vineyard, and here we sit today.
You were.
I was going to go back to answer the question about why South Africa. Phil's told you the process, but I always have two answers. The first, it depends on how I'm feeling. If I'm feeling kind of humorous, I say, well, we were looking to make wine in a place that was as far as possible away from where we lived. And the other one was, why did we choose South Africa? I say South Africa chose us because they invited us there and we fell in love with the potential that it had to make great wines.
What is it about South Africa that you think makes it special in terms of making great wine?
Well, from the wine side, interestingly, South Africa had a pretty deep history of winemaking and technical development going back into the 1700s. So when we decided we wanted to start our vineyard, there was some good technical information, people who knew what to do in different areas of expertise. And we tasted wines that we thought were very good, but could be better. We especially fell in love with the Sauvignon Blanc, which is still just fabulous. But the red wines, we thought could be seriously improved. And talk about the geography.
Yeah.
So one of the other things and just to contribute to your question, one of the things that was so clear when we were there, and we were there in January of 1990, just very shortly before Nelson Mandela came out of prison. And so it was an electric environment in all the positive ways. And as we were tasting the wines, one of the other things that really struck me is sort of, I would say, the purity of the fruit expression and the fact that, I came to call the South Africa, particularly the Cape region, as what I call the world's oldest New World wine growing region. So it was a very old industry, as Zelma indicated, and they were using very modern techniques and adapting those as quickly as they possibly could. Again, some barriers because of the apartheid era, and they weren't allowed to travel freely into a lot of countries. But probably the thing that struck me the most was this linkage between the site and the wines and how close that expression was. And what I came to understand is a large part of that is but people would ask me the question and say, what is it about the soils? And I'd say, well, the thing that strikes me is these are seriously old dirt. They're seriously old soils. And that I can tell you that because we find some very, very early stone tools on the surface of our soil that that the University of Cape Town dated at a minimum of 500,000 years old, and some were older. So these are very, very early stone tools. Basically, the kind of tools, the very early ones are when individuals would take two stones, bang them together, one would break, or maybe they both break, but they'd get a sharp edge. And those are basically roughly called flake tools. And we get a lot of flake tools, but we also get tools that are more thoroughly worked. And we think of in our modern sort of American idea, for example, Indian arrowheads that had been chipped off of a piece of a sharp stone, flint, whatever, and then been sharpened or worked to give a serrated edge or a sharper edge. Well, these tools were in our vineyard were relying on the soil surface, which said to me that there were no new soil deposits that had been laid down on top of those tools since those individuals dropped them on the ground and left them. And we have a lot of those tools in our vineyard. It's a little distracting to walk through the vineyard because I'm always looking at the soil because these stones will be lying on top of the dirt. So hence I would say, look, we know that these soils are at least 500,000 years old and probably older. And so I got into discussion one time with a person from Europe. We're talking about their stone tools at 50,000 years of age, and I said, well, you know, I'm not trying to one up you here, but we have like 10 times older than that, and our soil that's underneath it is older than yours. So you can't talk about old soils of Europe in my company. It was kind of a joke, but that struck me on our first trip, and it's a very clear signature, I think, of what goes into the wines or how the wines result.
So, Phil, you know, we talk in these tastings we've been having. We talk a lot about vine age, but I've been doing this a while. I've been buying and selling wine for almost a half century. I've never heard anybody talk about soil age ever. How does the soil age impact the wine?
Well, basically, the age of a soil really has to do with its capacity. And when I say capacity, I'm talking about capacity of the vine that it can grow, the size of the vine, and also what that vine can do. Now, when soils age over a long period of time, they usually we think about, well, they become depleted, okay? Whatever goodies are there are being used up. But also the soils continue to break down, they weather. And so what we have, I'll use an example of our Vilafonte soils, is we have a lot of clay particles. And clay, just imagine that clay is about as fine as you get in physical size and structure of soil particles. And those clay particles, when they pack together, they tend to hold nutrients a lot. There's a lot of surface area because you have a lot of very small particles. And there's a lot of interstitial space between those soil particles, and all those spaces can hold water and they can hold nutrients. Hold it is one thing. Giving it up is another thing. And vines really have to struggle in order to extract water and nutrients from these soils. And it's a kind of casual, but I think it's a fair. Somebody may argue with me out there who's a soil scientist, but that's really what we were looking for, because we tend to get vines that I think their whole lives they live in near-death experience. You know, they think, oh my goodness, I'm not going to survive out here. So the whole trick about growing fine wine is to encourage the vine to actually have those what I call near-death experiences, because they tend to make a small vine. They don't grow very large physically. They tend to make small berries, and small berries are where you get most of the concentration, because the surface of the skin to the volume of the juice ratio is really high when you have small berries. And so I'm talking about Cabernet Sauvignon berries for us that are routinely at 1 gram or less per berry. Now, just for reference, a US nickel, I don't know what it weighs now, but a US nickel in the old days when they really had metals in there would weigh about 5 grams. So 1 US nickel would be 5 berries. And if you think about the amount of surface area of skin ratio to the juice, there's a lot there to be extracted. So that's the whole reason for dirt age in a short.
Laura Catena talked about the soils in Mendoza being sexy, and everybody laughed. Sexy soils, that's kind of a bizarre thought. But what she was talking about was that the soil was alive. That there was life in the ground.
Yeah.
And that's just her way of expressing it.
I think it's a great expression, and I will say that I think she's a fabulous, passionate envoy for paying attention to the life of the soil. And I agree with you 100%. We routinely are basically we're farming to keep the soil. Well, over the period of time we've owned this piece of land, we have moved the soil tilth markedly forward in that more natural organic material in it and so forth, because these soils are difficult to work with. So I would rather have soils that are difficult to work with and then rebuild them, which we've been doing, or you can have really what I call chocolate cake soils, where things grow like a weed and you get these big vines, and it's another type of agriculture. So my preference was, when I saw this land, was to say this is something we can build on, as opposed to trying to tame it and pull down the vegetative capacity.
We had one of these tastings with Abin Sadi, and I asked him if he knew you, and he said to be sure to tell you hello. It was a fascinating conversation, to say the least, with him. He's a very unusual guy.
I don't know.
From Sadi family in Swartland.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Oh sure. Even, yeah.
Anyway, he said to be sure to tell you hello. Zelma, you said that you were struck by the quality of Sauvignon Blanc in South Africa, not Chenin Blanc. Yes?
Well, the Sauvignon Blanc was a wine that we could just casually encounter, and it was always delicious, but had a beautiful fruit character, not so much the sort of herbal pea green character.
Right.
The rest of the wines didn't really ring that bell for us. That the Sauvignon Blanc was beautifully aromatic, had very good flavors, good length. It just naturally showed well, where the rest of them didn't. And I don't think we tasted a lot of Chenin Blanc at the time. It wasn't a focus of the South African wine growers. They, like us, were looking at the big Cabernet, Bordeaux blends, Chardonnay. Chardonnay, they were just starting to grow. So they were, that was 1990. They were probably 20 years behind California in what they were looking to do, and the cellar equipment and so on.
So
Have you
just
any thought of farming Sauvignon Blanc or making a Sauvignon Blanc at Vilafonte?
You know, Phil and I and Mike decided when we started together on the Vilafonte project in 2003 was that we would be very focused. Part of that is that I'd had experiences both at Mondavi and Simi of making multiple varieties, which was very popular at the time. But I realized as a winemaker that you can only focus, you only have the time and energy and expertise to focus on so many. And the more varieties you work with, really the less expertise you develop with each one. So I wanted to just focus on what we thought we could do very well. And it was clear that the Bordeaux varietals grew well in South Africa.
Would you
So
talk to us a
stayed-
little bit about the 2017 Seriously Old Dirt?
could I just jump in for a second?
Yes.
I just want to add one thing
Okay.
about Sauvignon Blanc, and agree with Zelma 100%. We were also struck. We could go to restaurants and drink really good wines for not very much money at that time. It was pretty incredible. But one of the things that we took away from the Sauvignon Blanc experience and the aroma and flavor profiles was that the South Africans would try, well, in our first visit there, they would try to convince us that South Africa was a hot growing region. Okay, we weren't convinced of that. And we use as proof of that the South African Sauvignon Blancs. You cannot produce the character and style of wines that the South Africans can do with Sauvignon Blanc in a hot growing region. You just can't do it. So I call that a proxy indicator. They were, I think, maybe somewhat self-deprecating when talking about a hot climate. And also, the other thing about it is that the humidity in South Africa, in the Cape, is higher than our humidity here in California, for example. So on a discomfort index, it's less comfortable because it feels hotter to a human being. If the relative humidity is higher, you don't get the evaporation off your skin and the cooling. So I just wanted to add that because it's an indicator, very much an indicator of what the climate's like there, that the style and character wines that they can produce there. That whetted our interest even more so.
Phil, you were responsible for Opus One in the beginning, right? Didn't you plant weren't you responsible for the vineyards? When the joint venture started, weren't you in charge?
The joint venture was underway when I joined Mondavi. I came there in 1982, and they had begun in 1979. Right. The Opus Winery had not been built yet, and there was no when I joined the Mondavi organization, there was no home per se. Opus didn't own vineyards. They had a right granted by Robert Mondavi to have access to Tokelon and some of the other vineyards, but it was while I was recently, after I got to Mondavi in 1982, that we undertook the development of vineyards around what's the winery itself. And that, I was, to answer your question without that backstory, I was very involved in that design, and particularly pushing it to higher density, more narrow rows and in-row spacing that was higher density.
That goes back to your talking about the vine thinks it's going to die, right? So if you plant the vines closer together, they encounter the roots of the other vine, and they are fighting harder for nutrients and water and in an effort to survive, right?
Right, yeah.
It's counterintuitive. The more vines you plant, the less yield you get, right?
Wait, let me pick up on this seriously old dirt
Okay.
and say that this wine is all from our vineyards. And the first, our 2003 was our first vintage. In 2012, we decided, instead of selling the wine that didn't go into the series M and C, and there was always some of that because we don't use pressed wine in any of our wines. And we always have young vines because we're into our 5th planting on that 100 acres. We didn't try to plant it all at once, which was a very good strategy. So this wine has a lot of young Cabernet because we had planted some recent Cabernet blocks. And it also has some of the press wine that we don't use in the Series M and Series C. And we felt back in 2012 that we could produce a nice wine that would pick up some of this wine that we weren't able to use for one reason or another. So we have done that clear through 2017. And Phil told you where the name came from. And I would like to go back and just add that the people who made those stone tools were called Homo ergaster. They were older than Homo sapiens. And Homo ergaster line died out. And they were common in the Cape. So we were a little nervous about finding stone tools in the vineyard. And we asked through another person of the geologists and anthropologists at University of Cape Town what those stone tools were.
So talk a little bit about, I know, I remember this Tasting National. Talk a little bit about the amazing technological application that you made to the plantings at Vilafonte. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. It's a pretty extraordinary story. Please.
Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking. Well, what are the key points? Well, basically, because the soils are, as I said, they're old, they're not high, and I use capacity. Okay. Oftentimes people will say the vines are very vigorous, and I'm not very fond of that word because vigor is actually it really is it's a verb, but people talk about the vine size and so forth, and I think about capacity. How large can that vine grow? How many grapes can it produce? How many bunches of grapes, and what are those characteristics going to be? And so we knew the soils weren't going to be very productive. So sometimes people push vines close together to compete, like you said before, right? So to slow them down, we did something a little bit different. I looked for a site that was low capacity, and we had to put the vines close together in order to get any kind of a yield at all, because the per vine yield, I mean, is sometimes is less than a pound per vine, and so we need more vines on a hectare, on an acre, in order to make this make sense. And now a lot of people are thinking, how do you make the wine business make sense on that kind of level? And all you can do, because the yields are low, it required us to make really outstanding wines, and wines that we could with good conscience and reliability develop as very, very high level wines and price them accordingly. So what we did then was used all the technology that we had available. Now you realize this is back in the mid 1990s. We had something that we use that we could drag across the soil that would basically bounce, would send a radio wave into the soil and then record the reflection of that. And it would tell us something about the depth and some of the characteristics of the soil. It didn't tell us a lot, but it basically about what the actual composition was, but it told us where to look for differences. So I could tell where boundaries were, where soils changed. And so we decided that we would plant the vineyard in fairly small units. So our vineyard blocks, the largest vineyard block we have is 1 hectare, about a little less than 2.5 acres in a block. And let me tell you, as an example, Cabernet blocks, we have a very imaginative kind of block designation. It starts at A and works through the alphabet. But anyway, so we have blocks of Cabernet, A, B, C, and D, that are literally side by side. They're separated by 5.5 feet, the width of our row, from A block to B block to C block to D block. And Zelma can bear witness and testify to this, that each one of those blocks is dramatically different. And each one of them brings something different to a blend, and each one of them, sometimes they will maybe be used in a different blend. So the idea is always to get to the smallest harvest unit you can work with in a practical fashion. So the winery was designed about this maximum 1 hectare size vineyard blocks, with the idea that each of the blocks could be kept separate, so that then, you know, basically give Zelma and our winemaker a palette of characters and attributes, characteristics to work with, to the final blends.
Yes, and it's been a great experience. I think it's probably the high point of my winemaking career, because we've worked with all these blocks now for some of them for 20 years. And they become like individuals, even though they're next door to each other, they're different. And the differences, what I call the personality, the expression, are fairly consistent. Although the vintage may affect their expression, they stay within their individual personality. And so we have blocks that all the time go into Series C. We have blocks all the time that go into Series M. And then we have a whole group of blocks that, depending on the year, can go either way. And when we're blending, whether it's seriously old dirt or C or M, we blend entirely by taste. So we don't have a formula for any of our wines of the percent, this, that, or the other thing. Now, what we're growing is Cabernet Merlot, Malbec, and Cabernet Franc. So those are the backbone and the flesh of all of the 3 wines we're making.
And are all the grapes that you just mentioned make up the blend of Seriously Eau Dirt as well? I know you mentioned that it has a lot of Cabernet, correct?
This year is more, is not a high Cabernet percentage. It's 37% Malbec, 36% Merlot, and a little bit of Cabernet Franc, and the balance is Cabernet Sauvignon. But as our vineyard has matured, we have had more Cabernet to go into the Seriously Old Dirt, and that vineyard is very close to a tipping point where it will tip over. It's 7 years old this year. It will start to tip over into Series C or Series M wines, if history is the teacher.
So
I have 2 questions, if possible. Do you experiment with different barrels, or are you just using one type of barrel? And if so, what is that? And then my second question is, on the Seriously Old Dirt, how many cases are you producing? I mean, you have 100 acres, you do 3 wines. How many cases do you produce?
I don't know.
What's supposed to be a good question?
I can tell you a lot, but the number of cases we produce
Well-
is not top of mind, except when I'm doing the blending. However, as time goes on, we are wanting to increase the percent of Cabernet in the seriously old dirt. So we have contracted with some people who grow Cabernet in a very good area to grow it under our guidelines and oversight, so that we'll be able to expand the amount of Cabernet. But this particular year just reflect, it was a fairly good crop.
So it was 89 barrels was listed as being production. So
Relatively small.
yeah, it's pretty small.
So
Yeah.
that's 89 barrels times 60 gallons divided by 750 cc's.
I
That
can't
would give
So
you
it's like 1,000 cases or something like that.
very tiny.
Yeah.
And your barrel selection, are you using French oak? Are you using, and if so, are you using a certain forest?
Well, let me just say that when I came to South Africa, I already had a very deep experience in working with barrels. Because since I was in Mondavi, I had been responsible for purchasing the barrels both at Mondavi and Simi. So what I had learned is that, like a winery, every cooperage has a personality. They get their wood from certain places, they age it a certain way, and they put the barrels together a certain way. So it's really interesting. The coopers do have a personality in their barrels. The other thing I learned was that some coopers are very professional and able to produce the same quality and style of barrels year after year, where there were other coopers who you could get good barrels from them one year and the next year the barrels wouldn't be good, i.e. the wood might be green, they would impart astringency and so on. So by the time I got to South Africa, I was working with Francois Frere from Burgundy and Terence from Bordeaux. And then I've always experimented with other coopers when they have a good reputation and they come along. So I think now we have 5 different coopers we use. One specifically for Cabernet Franc, but only as the second use of the barrel. And most of them are still the majority, probably 2/3 are Terence and Francois Frere.
We have a question from Shirian and Anita. This serious old dirt is so resolved in spite of its youth. Has this wine hit its stride, or what do you think the drinking window is? P.S. We're the ones that are on our second bottle. It's amazing.
I would say the lifetime of your wines in your cellar to them is not very long, no matter what the capability is to age.
Well, I think it's a pretty youthful wine. It's delicious.
Yeah,
But
Yes, it is.
it has a long life ahead of it, I would say.
Yes, and let me just provide an answer to that. Phil and I have been, both of us worked at Mondavi at different times. So we have a lot of Mondavi wines in our cellar and many other wineries that we've either owned, worked with, and had as customers. We have been gobsmacked by the age of the wines we've tasted and how good they are. And I think as winemakers in California, we haven't given enough credit to our grapes and our winemaking. We let me give you an example. We just tasted a 74 Petit Syrah from Robert Mondavi. Still had great color, beautifully balanced, no sense of tiredness. Same comments for a 95 Sangiovese from Long Vineyards, and 91 Sauvignon Blanc from Long Vineyards, and 90 Semillon. All of those wines were, I mean, they're old. They're 20, 30, 40 years old. And so I know that our first series C&M still youthful. That was 2003. This wine will probably last that long. It's not the powerhouse, but it has the things that I think give longevity, which is concentration of fruit flavor and balance. So the harmony between the alcohol and the tannins and the acids creates a complete feel. And then the fruit intensity will continue for a long time. So we didn't really make it with the intention of having people cellar it like they do the C&M. But I know enough about our grapes and wines that it will age well.
Well, I know that Chirian, because he asked me, he opened it 2 hours before he poured it and decanted it an hour before he poured it. So that has an effect on how it's showing in the glasses. He didn't just open the bottle and pour himself a glass. So he, I guess it turned out, I guess this once I gave him good advice. Did you say, did you say that there were 4 people in your class at UC Davis?
Well, 5, including me.
Were you the only female?
Yeah.
How important in your career, well, both of you, how important in your careers, which are important, I would say, in wine, is schooling and experience, and how much of it was you were born with it? Because you talked about let me just finish so you understand the question I'm asking, because I don't think I asked it very clearly. You talked about the different parcels at Vilafonte, and the average person tasting, either tasting the grapes or tasting wine made from those different parcels would not discern any difference, much difference, if any. But to the two of you, they're dramatically different. And that, I think that's something you have to be born with.
I respectfully disagree.
Okay.
I think that what the key point is in sensory work is A, an interest in learning, and B, the conditions to learn. Because, most of us don't grow up in a family that sits around a dinner table and talks about the flavor and texture and complexity and length of the food. I mean, I didn't grow up. My family loved food, but we didn't talk about the sensory details of the food. And if you're making fine wines, you do have to learn to be very sensitive to all parts of the wine. And that's part of the process for the masters of wine. They not only learn by tasting a lot of wines, they have a system that they've developed where when they start tasting, they're looking for a certain pattern from the front to the middle to the end to the finish with regards to flavor, concentration, texture, length, and so on. So I'm sure that there are people who have intrinsically, physiologically super sensitive palates. I'm not one of them, but I am a very good taster, and part of it is I've done it for a long time. great attention to it, and I love it. I love blending the wines. It's fascinating.
You know, I was at a tasting a few years ago. This is quite a few years ago at Balthazar in New York City. There were 10 master sommeliers and Rajpar and I sitting around a big table. I don't know how I got invited, but somehow I got invited. And everybody brought a bottle of wine or two in a brown paper bag, and we were, you know, passing the wines around and blind tasting them and trying to embarrass each other. And Larry Stone was there. And of course, Larry's the most gifted blind taster in the world. So he always goes last, because if Larry says it's White Zinfandel, you can't say it's Riesling, because Larry's always right. And Daniel Jonas from Montrachet had brought this bottle of wine, and we went around the table, and I mean, we were all over the map. I mean, nobody had a clue what this wine was. And these are serious guys. And finally it came to Larry, and he said, he went through the process that you talked about, the rigorous process of how you try to determine what a wine might be. And at the end of it, he said, so my only conclusion is that it's a 1989 Barbera d'Alba made by Angelo Gaia. And here's why I think that. Even though I know Angelo Gaia doesn't make Barbera d'Alba, has never made a Barbera d'Alba, the only logical conclusion based on what I see, smell, and taste is that this is a Barbera from Alba from the 1989 vintage made by Angelo Gaia. Well, Daniel Jonas literally fell on the floor, because it was the 1989 Angelo Gaia Barbera d'Alba, and Angelo Gaia made one case of Barbera d'Alba in 1989, never made one before or since. And Larry figured it out.
Yeah.
Larry figured it out.
Extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
I think you have to be born with that. That's some kind of genius that few people on the planet could possibly have.
It's the sensory, but it's also the intellectual, and it's also the experience. I mean, you have to have tasted a huge amount of wines to be able to go down that list and get there.
Sensory memory, it's a tough thing to remember all those aromas and tastes and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even know it was a Barbera. I don't remember what I said, but I didn't say it was Barbera. Certainly didn't say it was from Alba. Were you the only female in your class at UCW?
Yes, but to me, it was no big deal. It wasn't a big class.
Do you think of yourself as, and is it important to you, your role as one of the first female sommeliers? It's not winemakers.
What important?
Your role, I mean, there was,
really,
when I first started in this business, Corinne Mensalopoulos, Philippine de Rothschild, Lalubis Leroy, and I guess Anne-Claude Laflave had come along, were about it as far as female winemakers in the world, and Philippine and well, two of them weren't winemakers, they were winery owners. And then all of a sudden you and Helen Turley came along. And now it seems like half the people I talk to in these conferences are female, which is amazing.
Well, but in fact, there is a couple who studied all the winemakers in California and keep up to date on who's working where. And there's about 12% lead winemakers as women. So, but we're very gifted. So
I think wine is better because of female winemakers. I think that's part of it. I mean, there's a lot of reason that average wine quality has increased over the
Yeah.
48 years I've been doing this. But I think one of them is, there's some extraordinary women in the world, like, as we mentioned, Laura Catena and Gaia and Elisa Scavino and, Violet Gergich and a lot of people. Chantal Forthen at Flowers. She's got to be about 30 years old and she's making amazing wine.
Yeah. Well, I celebrate every woman who comes into the wine business, because one of the outcomes of my being an early winemaker and having a pretty high career profile through my association and activity at Mondavi and CME is I've always had a lot of women come to me and to want to talk about becoming a winemaker or how to do it, or some technical input needed. And I've hired a lot of women who've gone on to be very successful.
I mean, we have a tasting Saturday with Paradigm. That's Heidi Barrett and, Laurel Sferro from Domaine de Pegao. And there's a lot of female winemakers really making really extraordinary wines in the world. So I congratulate you for being the vanguard of that. It's an important part. It's an important legacy that you have.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Phil, at that tasting at Tom Black's house in Nashville, there was some NASA technology that you applied to the planting of the vineyards originally. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. Yes. In a sense, yes. That technology was actually born out of necessity from my side. Just a quick version of it. Basically, what NASA was able to do, and some of the people in this call may be old enough to remember.
Excuse me, allow me to interrupt for just a second. I apologize, but Catherine is exactly right. We should all taste the M now, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to.
I apologize for interrupting, but please finish, please. But I would encourage everyone to taste the M while you talk.
Okay, good. I'll try to keep it short and sweet, which is a real challenge sometimes. But basically, the technology is born out of the fact that in the 80s, late 80s, we were seeing phylloxera wiping out some of the vineyards in Napa Valley. And I have a guiding principle in life from a technology standpoint or just a life standpoint, is I always want to be able to see what I call over the horizon. What's on the other side of that hill? And the hill in this particular case was the knowledge hill of how do we replant and develop new vineyards. And particularly to bring it down very specifically is which of the vineyards that we had at the time at Mondavi and all the growers we bought from which ones were going to die first, and sort of a sequence and severity of when we're going to lose vineyards. So it's I say sometimes sometimes you can get so many promotions in a job that you got time to actually think about stuff. And I was sitting in my office one day, I was thinking about this problem, and I thought, if anybody knows the answer to this question, it's got to be NASA. And of course, Oakville is pretty close to the NASA at Moffett Field. And so I picked up the phone and I called NASA Moffett Field. And I told them I wanted to speak to someone about plant remote sensing of plants. And the gal on the phone didn't have a clue. So we started this, what I call a bounce. And so she would transfer me to somebody and they would go, oh no, man, you need to talk to somebody else. They would transfer me. I went through about 6 or 8 of those transfers. I got a hold of a guy. He picked up the phone and I told him what I was looking for, and there was a silence. And he said, how did you know what we were working on? And I said, I didn't have a clue. And I told him the path I got there. And he said basically what they were doing is they were using remote sensing that was an extension beyond of what was it, Francis Gary Powers got shot down over Russia in the 60s, I guess it was, because his U-2 aircraft had lost power, and he got low enough that the MiG jets could get high enough they could send a missile to shoot him down. Anyway, what he was doing at that time, he was taking images, regular camera, taking images of Russian wheat fields, because they could, at that time, they could tell from an image in the springtime after, I don't know much about wheat, even though I used to grow it as a kid. After the first branching, when the first two leaves are formed, you can tell what the potential is for yield on a wheat field. And so the US government would try to estimate how much wheat the Russians were going to have. And in years when it looked like they were going to be short on a wheat crop, there was always imprimer from the US government to talk about arms limitation. So that's the background.
Wow.
So basically it's looking at plants, and the technology evolved a lot, and we no longer did it from U-2 aircraft. But I got to go and actually tour Moffett Field and walk up and touch a U-2, that then what I call U-2, but the newer versions of it. And you realize how small physically these guys had to be to actually fit in those cockpits. And it's basically a rocket. And they would light the fuse in Moffett Field. They would clear all the inbound and outbound air traffic from San Francisco International and Oakland. And this guy would take off from Moffett Field, and he would it was a rocket with wings on it. And he'd get up to 70,000 feet and cruise over and take images and come back. And it only had one wheel on it. And when he landed, the guys would run along the side and catch the wings, so the wings didn't hit the ground and break. It was pretty archaic. It reminded me of my first, downhill racer. Where you put wheels on like a little race car and you go down. And you don't have a brake. You don't have good steering. You don't have anything else. It was basically a rocket with a man and wings strapped to it. So that evolved into using very, very sophisticated electronic technology to separate out wavelengths to look at reflected from plants to figure out how they were performing. And the first performance was how do they respond to phylloxera, but then we evolved that technology to say how does a plant actually respond to water stress or to other things that we do to it. And then we can very much right down to a sub-meter resolution. I can look at today. We have technology. We can look at individual vines and their signature. It isn't like a regular photograph, but it's a scan, basically a spectral scan of that individual vine and or the whole vineyard. There's no way to make that a really short story, but it's a fun story.
We could cancel the whole rest of the thing just that story. I wouldn't want to have missed that part. That's for sure. About the guys running along beside the U-2 catching the wings. That's
I was there one time when one of them took off, and it is a heart-stopping effect. I mean, the guy's basically sitting on fuel and a rocket engine in this little bitty compartment, and it's you see normal aircraft, they take off and then they get to a certain height and they start to go up pretty steeply. Well, this guy, I mean, when he starts to go airborne, it's almost like he goes straight out. I mean, it was just incredible, and it hurt actually to be close to it because the vibration was so strong from the engine. Anyway,
imagine what it was like inside that cockpit.
Yeah, exactly.
So Zelma, would you talk a little bit about the 2014 Series M?
Yes, we were, first of all, I'll say we were quite pleased with the vintage, because one of the things that we monitor are not only the size of the berries, but the consistency of ripening within the canopy. So this was a vintage where we had a very short bloom, And therefore we had a very consistent ripeness, which leads to more intensity in the wine. And the thinking behind the Series M from the beginning was that we had blocks of Merlot and Cabernet that seemed to be fleshier. And you'd expect that with Merlot, but not so much with Cabernet. And in time, we planted Malbec and found that that was a wonderful addition to this wine, which we're looking to be fleshy and fruity as opposed to the Series C, which is more structured, deep wine. We want this to be more expressive, more red fruit. And that is what we're looking for. You tasters need to be thinking about that and see how you feel we've met that goal. The wine was aged for 22 months in French oak, but with the Series M, we've always used a fairly small amount of French oak, say, depending on the vintage, somewhere between 15 and 20%, because Cabernet is able to soak up new oak and just spit out aromas that are so integrated. Merlot and Malbec are more delicate. So to go back to the question about barrels, with each of these blocks, when we started and continuing, we would test the different barrels we were working with until we came to a conclusion about what kind of barrels the wine needed to be in, not only the cooper, but the age. So with the exception of 2 blocks of Merlot, the Merlot was housed and aged in older oak. And the Malbec has historically been housed and aged in older oak. And this wine has, let me just check, it's 25% Cabernet, as all of her Series M do, because the Cabernet provides, to me, the foundation for the wine, the structure upon which we build the flavor and flesh with the Merlot and the Malbec.
Is your model for these 2 wines Bordeaux? Do you think that way?
Well, it really isn't, but as a trio, we started out thinking about since we had Bordeaux wines in the vineyard, making a first and second wine. But I started making wine from the vineyard before it was really ready to be blended and released, because I wanted to see what kind of wine each of these blocks made. And it was my opinion from that there weren't any bad blocks. There were blocks that maybe were younger or needing more attention or might be different from year to year. But I just thought it was a mistake to slot some of these grapes into the idea of a second wine. So I proposed, based on what I saw several years of winemaking them separately, that we make 2 wines of 2 different styles coming out of the vineyard. And that's what we've done. And that's really worked well for us, because people have different palates and preferences and, uses for wine with different foods. So we've been able to give people some choice.
This may be completely off base, but, I have a long history with these wines, going back pretty far to, that night at Tom's house, and have loved them and bought and sold them all these years. I've always kind of thought of the Series M of being a right bank Bordeaux and the Series C being a left bank Bordeaux, because of the predominance of Merlot and the predominance of Cabernet.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, but I was just saying that that wasn't in my mind.
Right.
When I started to blend these, I was coming from what the vineyard was doing.
What was it like? I assume you had a pretty close working relationship with Robert Mondavi. What was that like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have nothing but admiration, respect, and affection for Robert Mondavi. He was, he really had a vision. He was really passionate. And when I started working with him, Mike Gergich was the chief enologist. And Bob Mondavi would go around with us in the morning tasting the tanks, and he would say, oh, this needs to be cooler or warmer. You know, and he would give his opinion. Of course, Mike was actually more experienced winemaker than Bob Mondavi, but we just enjoyed his participation because he was so enthusiastic, very good natured, you know. So if we ignored what he said and did what we thought was the right thing for the wine, it wasn't a big issue. But the one thing that he really felt passionate about was the use of barrels in aging. And he was really the first modern winery in Napa Valley to bring in high quality barrels and use them on his Cabernet and Chardonnay and other varieties, but those predominantly. The other thing about Bob Mondavi that was fun is he always wanted to try something new. So we would get grapes from the Central Coast. We'd get several different new barrels from a cooper that he met. There was always something new to do with him.
Did you have to keep your distance from Mike Gergich?
No, I didn't.
Really?
Yeah, I was lucky with Mike because I just found him fascinating. He never lost his colloquialisms for wine, and we would go from tank to tank in the morning. And when the wines are fermenting, you're taking juice out and it's very foamy. And he would look at it and he'd say, this looks like white eggs. I'd be thinking, what could that be? Oh, egg whites, yeah. But he was, he was well-grounded technically. So I learned a lot from him technically, but he also had a really good palate. And I was doing all the analytical work in the lab. And I would, show him a whole page of like 4 dozen analyses that I've done. And he'd look at one of them and he'd say, that doesn't look right. And I was so annoyed. So I'd go back and do it, and it wasn't right.
Wow.
And the other thing I learned with him was sensor evaluation. He had a good palate, but it really took me, if I look back, my palate continued to develop through the years. I wasn't nearly as good in sensory work at Mondavi as I was in Simi, not nearly as good at Simi as I've been at Vilafonte. It's a really interesting skill.
Marvin Overton do you remember Marvin Overton, the great collector from Fort Worth?
Yep.
He had a tasting at my restaurant with Mr. Mondavi. Well, he had one with Joe Heitz, and then he had one with Mondavi and Mr. Mondavi, and then he had one with Paul Draper. If we'd done it a 4th year, maybe it would have been you, but we didn't get there. But we were all, you can imagine Nashville, this little tiny restaurant in Nashville, Tennessee, we were so excited Robert Mondavi was going to be walking through the door. It was just, kind of hard to imagine that this was getting ready to happen. And so I and, a couple of the, movers and shakers in Nashville were standing at the front door to greet Mr. Mondavi. And he walked right past us and kissed my head waitress on the mouth and said, "I sure am glad to be in Nashville."
He always had his priorities, right? Yeah.
And she was absolutely thrilled. She wasn't the least bit offended. I'm sure she might. I wish I had a picture of it, but it was it was 3 different events. I mean, we had Joe Heights, who was impossible to deal with, and just a nightmare from the first moment till the end. When we finally got him out of the restaurant and on his way, he was just a nightmare. And Mr. Mondavi, who's he was a small guy, but his presence filled the room. He was incredibly charismatic guy. And then Paul, who's so cerebral and so genteel, and so 3 really, really different guys, 3 great, and then Marvin, of course, 3 great experiences. So we should talk about. I mean, it's amazing that the people that you've worked with, the 2 of you have worked with, your careers have, spanned a period of, an important time in the wine industry in California and now South Africa, to work with people like Robert Mondavi, and I want to recognize that. So we should talk about the Series C, because again, we're running out of time. Because I talked.
I mean, Phil talked earlier about his thinking in laying out the vineyard and managing the vineyard such that there's a small amount of fruit on each vine, the berries are small, and that has been, I mean, his design of the vineyard and his setting up the viticultural management and keeping an eye on it through the years has resulted in consistently fine fruit for us. And, it's fruit that has a great deal of intensity of flavor, which to me is the most important thing in the fruit and wine I work with. And the Series C, because of the high percent of Cabernet, which has varied anywhere from 55% to 85%, it is probably the most intensely flavored. It will probably age 40 years instead of 20 or 25 years from the end. And so the Series C was born out of selection of the Cabernet as a base, and the most intense Cabernet, and the most, and then using the Merlot and Malbec and Cabernet Franc to make it complete. And as I mentioned earlier, the Malbec, let me just look. The Malbec, for example, is 9% in this wine. And the 15 vintages are really super vintage. And I would, I hate to say I wouldn't drink it now because it's 5 years old, but it's certainly a wine that's going to continue to develop aromatics, wonderful aromatics over time. But the Malbec, even that 9%, is very important in giving flesh to that structure. And there's Cabernet Franc. We have a small amount of Cabernet Franc. It goes into the Series C because it has an elegance. It tends to have some floral notes. It's not a big powerhouse, but it lends a completely different set of aroma and flavors. So, and then the Merlot that we use in the Series C is a Merlot that thinks it's Cabernet. It doesn't taste like Cabernet, but it has the power and intensity. So that's how the Series C style evolved. And every year we taste every block and every nuance from the block, which would be different barrels, new, old, different coopers, maybe some different experiments. So we have a table that's probably 20 feet long, lined with wines when we start the blending. And we're tasting them and deciding, are they a C candidate or an M candidate or a seriously altered candidate? But with that template, mental sensory template in mind. And this this blend is 57% Cabernet, 19% Merlot, 15% Cabernet Franc, and 9% Malbec. So it is brings in a lot of diversity of flavors with those combinations. And in our vineyard, because the blocks are so small and we know them so well, it's very clear that if that vineyard were all Cabernet, there would still be a huge amount of diversity just due to the soil and site diversity. So it's the interaction of the diversity of the site, the 4 different varieties, and the diversity within each variety of expression that gives a lot of complexity for us to work with.
You know, if I tasted this Series C blind, I don't think that I would think it was Bordeaux. I mean, I don't know. If I was having a good day, I might know it was a New World wine, you know, or if I had a hangover. You know, Clive Coates told me one time that anytime he was going to have a really serious wine tasting, he got really drunk the night before because his palate was more sensitive when he was hungover. Which I don't do that, but you know, maybe I would be more successful if I had employed that strategy. But if I was having the point I'm trying to get to is if I was having a really good day, I might recognize this wine for what it. I don't know that I automatically default to South Africa, but I would think it was a Bordeaux blend from the New World, probably. I think, maybe, on a good day. But if I opened a bottle of, you know, Kat's showing us a picture of the berries, how tiny they are. If I opened a bottle of, you know, Chateau Coast d'Estournel, 2015, and poured myself a glass, or Lynch Bage, or Duar Milon Rothschild, or one of those wines, not the first gross, but because I don't want to sound ridiculous. But if this was Chateau Coast d'Estournel, 2015, in my glass, and I tasted it, I would be thrilled.
Well, you know, when I started winemaking in 1970, Bob Mondavi was driven to make wines as good as the French, but not necessarily like them. And I feel the same way. You know, we don't really want our wines to taste like Bordeaux, but we want what you're striving for is the essence of quality, which is complexity, harmony, and intensity in the area that you are. And I felt for a long time that the South African wines lie somewhere between California and Europe. They have a little more fruit expression than the classic Bordeaux, but they're not as big and fleshy and powerful. They're more restrained than the California Cabernets. And that's great. It means that that land and that climate produces wines distinctive to it.
Well, what I was really saying is that I think it's a truly extraordinary wine, that this 2015 Series C, this bottle,
Thank
in
you.
that glass, in this room tonight, is an extraordinary wine. And I don't want to, be ridiculous, but it might be the best predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon wine I've tasted in quite a while from anywhere in the world.
It's
And
quite
I
a
taste a
statement.
lot of wine.
Well, thank you.
It is a very, truthfully, it is a very, very special wine, I think. And
Thank you.
and one of the things I've learned in doing these tastings for almost a year, where I open generally five bottles of wine a week, and the woman in my life doesn't drink. So what do I do with all this wine? Sometimes they're too good to give away. But what I found is if I put the cork back in the bottle and put it on the kitchen table, in 3 or 4 days, it tastes like it aged for 4 years. It just gets better. And I think if I put the cork back in this Series C and drink it with something Sunday night, it's going to be really glorious.
Yes, it's absolutely true. This wine, it can go a long time and getting better. And it's actually quite amazing how resilient it is when it's partial in a bottle. And we've seen that.
It's extraordinary. You're to be congratulated. It is.
I want to tell a quick story because I sell the wines, and so I had just started with Broadbent, maybe it's like 10 and a half years ago, and I was up at the Cherry Festival up in Michigan, and I was working the market, and it's a really nice restaurant, and the owner had told me that he had never tasted a South African red wine that he thought was any good. So I said, really? Okay. So the next day I went in there for dinner. I asked him if he was going to be in. He said yes. And I went in for dinner and I brown bagged a bottle of Vilafonte. And I sent him a glass into the kitchen. And then after a while he came out and he's like, wow, that wine was really fantastic. And I'm like, do you want to guess where it's from? He goes, I think it's a Napa Valley Cabernet. It's one of the best I've had in a long time. I think he was floored when I pulled out the bottle and it was Vilafonte, and it was from South Africa. He did buy, by the way. He did buy. So,
so I almost always end these conversations with the same question. And I don't exactly know how to ask this question of both of you, but I'm going to ask the question and you can answer it however you wish. And I'm not asking what's the greatest wine you've ever tasted, because I know what that is. That's the 62 Leroy La Romane that we had in the kitchen at Tom Black's house that night. But you may not remember it, but I do, and it was the best wine you've ever tasted. But what's your most memorable wine experience?
That's really a tough question. The reason it's tough for me is that I have worked in many different countries with many different people, tasted thousands of wines. But I would say that one of the most interesting, eye-opening experiences I've had, and this was with Phil, we made wine in the Rheingau for 3 years from Riesling. And I realized why Riesling is the way it is there. because the nights are so short in the summer. There's so much sun, and yet it's cool. It's an extraordinary combination of growing conditions. And so the wine, one of the wines we made was in 1998. And we have tasted that wine on and off every year since then. And it just keeps evolving. It's just beautiful and changing. That's probably one of the most profound experiences, because we made the wine, we knew the conditions, we learned about the Rheingau, but we've been able to follow it for so long. It's just been spectacular experience.
Well, this has been a very, Phil, did you want to answer that question, or is?
No, I guess, I'm like Zelma, I would say that, that's a really tough question.
Yeah.
You've got an answer on the table there that I think is a really good answer. But I think what I would probably say, in addition to what you had suggested, is that because we do this as a business, and we work with other people and we travel quite a bit, I would say honestly that I probably learned something from every wine that I've ever tasted. They may be little increments and bits, but it's hard to then say which is the best one, because I look at it as a pursuit. It's like maybe the last one I tasted is the best I've ever had, or maybe it's a step up in something that, understanding what the winemaker and the wine grower were trying to do. So that's a really tough question. I do want to tell you though that from that same trip to Nashville, I remember an experience, probably more than the wine, and that is Tom Black taking a really good vintage of Margaux with us when we went to have lunch and hamburgers. And it was a divine combination. Something I would never have the fortitude to do. And he said, well, let's take something good, and so we went to this hamburger place.
Knowing Tom, it was probably the 61.
It very well might have been,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've done a lot of these, and I've actually been a little bit nervous about this one because I'm kind of in awe of the two of you. And I'm not easily awed, but I'm a little bit in awe of you. If anyone has any questions, we can answer them now, or otherwise, I asked you for an hour and a half of your time, and I don't want to take more than that. So thank you very much, Zelma and Phil, and thank you, Catherine, for helping make this happen. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And thank you, Zelma and Phil.
Yeah, and everybody who's sat through this, it's fabulous to have people who care that much about wine.
I will ask you one question, Phil and Zelma. If you could have a bottle of wine tonight from any winery in California, other than it probably wouldn't be Long Vineyards because that's your ex-husband, but any winery in California, what winery would it be?
Jeez.
What's the winery that you really respect?
Why not the world?
She wants to make it really difficult.
Boy,
you're California.
You're a really difficult guy.
Well, it's private. I'm not, nobody's going to see your answer.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just don't think of wines in that way.
Right.
Phil said, I think of them as an intersection, an experience, a fascination, a kind of magic. But, there's so many. There's 400 wineries in Sonoma and 500 in Napa. And just, if that isn't overwhelming to even think about what wine in that group you like.
Well, I would just add that, I don't know how to answer your question, but I can tell you that we have taken the opportunity, since we're home. Normally, we would be still be in South Africa at this point in time. We'd be finishing the vintage 2021, and we'd be sitting in summertime or fall, early fall, making a 2021 vintage. Instead, we're home with a dedicated purpose of working heavily on our cellar. And our cellar is large and somewhat disorganized, but with a lot of wines that we've had our fingerprints on over the ages. And, we're drinking through some of our 1970s Mondavis that, in the early 80s, and the Pinot Noir project in the early 80s of Mondavi that I was involved in very heavily. And it just, and wines that were gifted to us. And, we try to write dates on things when people give us something, and just doing the reminiscence. And every one of them it's like, some people say, when you start to get dementia or something, you get up in the morning and look in the mirror, there's always somebody new there. And, we just revel in those wines. And I can't say they're better than or best than, but it's just a wonderful experience. And that's what wine's all about, I think, is just, that enjoyment, that sheer hedonistic pleasure of just opening that bottle and the reminiscences and the thought about the wine.
Well, that dinner with that tasting and dinner with Robert Mondavi at my restaurant in Nashville, we had at dinner that night, we opened a Jeroboam of 74 Mondavi Reserve Cabernet. Were you there then?
I was not there,
But I was.
Zelma was.
Yeah. It was extraordinary is not a strong enough word for what that wine was in 1990. It was amazing.
Yeah.
And it was an incredible day, just spending the day with him. It was, magical. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time and all that you've meant to wine in the world for all these years. Thank you so much, both of you.
Well, wonderful to be together with you guys. Yeah.
Cheers, Zelma and Phil and Hoyt.
Kat,
Thank you.
Kat, I haven't seen you forever. It's just
No, I was hoping to meet you down in South Africa, my favorite place, my favorite country in the world. So soon, though.
Yeah, well,
I think
soon.
I think